Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know from coming to the Y and from moderating other panels of the Y that a lot of people who come to events here naturally understand the importance of Europe in our own histories for many of us, and the importance of Europe globally. But what I'm hoping we do tonight, which is an event that's focused in and around Jamie's new and terrific book, which I hope all of you have dutifully bought already. Yes?
They can buy it after.
Right. There's one person over there, I think, who didn't buy it. I know because I scanned your Amazon accounts before we came here. What I'd like to do is I really do want to focus on trying to talk about the ways in which Europe is part of our daily lives, and what's happening in Europe should feel part of your daily lives, and in the ways in which you should understand that what goes on in this country is actually related to what goes on in the rest of the world. So, without further ado, what I would like to do is start this panel with Jamie giving us a little bit of a encapsulation of the thesis of his book, and then we can go from there.
Sure. I think we're seeing in Europe a real crisis of values, and real crisis of liberal values. And living in Europe and reporting on the continent for years, no matter what topic I was writing on, it seemed that it all went back to that, whether it was the fraying transatlantic relationship with the United States, whether it was increasing Russian aggression and meddling in politics, which is something that was happening in Europe years before they started doing it in this country, whether it's the return of anti-Semitism, which sees three distinct forms. There's the far-right anti-Semitism that we're mostly familiar with, but there's also an increasingly virulent left-wing anti-Semitism, and of course the most violent kind, Islamist anti-Semitism. Historical revisionism, basically lying about the past, and all these awful traditions that we had thought Europe had basically put to rest, I saw just coming back.
Just tell me a little bit why it's the end of Europe and why it's not simply the changing of a new chapter.
Well, it's the end of Europe. I consciously chose the title because I think what I'm trying to warn about in the book is the end of Europe as we have known it, as a place of peace, generally, social harmony, economic prosperity, liberal democracy. All these things are being challenged. I think there were three main assumptions we had after 1989. The first was that liberal democracy everyone would agree to this, and it was, self-evident. I think the second was some regulated form of free market capitalism would be the best method of organizing our economies, and you saw social democratic parties coming into this understanding. Tony Blair, New Labour in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, introducing market reforms. Basically, the left would accept the market. And then the third was perpetual peace, and that Europe, the continent, would always be a place of peace. In fact, it would be a peace exporter. So NATO, before Donald Trump started calling it obsolete, there were lots of people in the 90s, once the Soviet Union collapsed, saying NATO has to go out of NATO has to go out of area or go out of business. And so you saw them going into the Balkans, you saw them going into Libya, and the notion that we would need NATO once again to protect continental Europe, people would have laughed at you. But now we've returned to this era where clearly NATO is very important. Its original purpose is very important.
So, Brett, can I ask you if you can drive home a little bit of what you see as the global effects of Europe going through this contraction, or Europe going through the abrogation, or at the very least confusion, of the values that Jamie just articulated. Can you tell us a little bit what that means for the rest of the world?
Well, Europe is half the West, and half the West has been in a state of crisis, actually I would say for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. France has not had more than a single quarter of 2% plus economic growth, I think, since the turn of the millennium. So that's 17 years ago. You have a continent in which youth unemployment, which is really a significant fact of life, often exceeds 25%. And you have a continent whose share of global GDP has been contracting steadily, losing market share, if you will, to China. So this is, from a global perspective, this is important because Europe no longer has any weight, relevance, or impact on much of what goes on in the world. Nowhere better illustrated, in my mind, than the crisis in Syria. I mean, the Syrian crisis is a European crisis because it has spilled over into European life so vividly. But what's so striking is the inability, unwillingness of any major European state to say, well, we should have some say in bringing this crisis to an end. So you now have literally, in many respects, a kind of a fundamental transformation of Europe and European values, including open borders, for example, all of that collapsing because of the refugee crisis, and yet Europe can't do anything about it. Now, in the 1990s, or in the last decade when you had a President Clinton or President Bush prepared to exercise some kind of policing role in the world, that wouldn't have been such a problem for Europe. It becomes a problem in the year of Obama and Trump when the United States just decides that it no longer wants to exercise the policing power that it previously had.
So you're saying essentially there is no West.
What I'm saying is the West is increasingly diminished. And I mean, look, the West is an idea, right? So to say there is no West is, in a sense, somewhat nonsensical. But that idea no longer has armature, or it doesn't have the kind of armature that it once did. Now, the chief factor in my mind is a kind of quasi-isolationism that the US has embarked on in a largely bipartisan basis in the last decade, really starting with Obama, but in a way exploding with Trump. But look, remember, back in the 1970s, you had a Helmut Schmidt to help steady the West during the crisis of the Baader-Meinhof brigades or the question of nuclear missiles in Europe. You had Margaret Thatcher telling George H.W. Bush, "Don't go wobbly, George," back in 1990 when the question of world order was in place. You had Helmut Kohl, just died a few days ago, leading the way towards the peaceful reunification of Germany and the remaking of Europe. Where are these people now? And I'm sorry, Angela Merkel is not it.
Okay, I'm going to actually make you come back to that in a second. But Julia, if you could talk a little bit about some of what you see as the power vacuum that happens globally and who comes into that space and what happens, and then what happens to a sense of shared, as Jamie put it, shared values or a shared sense of what the goals are in maintaining some sort of sense of peace or security in the world.
Yeah, you have an hour. Well, you saw that starting to crumble just on the question of NATO. I wanted to touch on what Brett said. When I was living and reporting in Russia from 2009 to 2012, in 2010, the Russian Defense Ministry put out a document stating what they felt were, they ranked the threats to Russia, and NATO was at the top of the list. At the time, if you recall, NATO was in Afghanistan.
Right.
NATO was basically obsolete. NATO was not, or it was obsolete in the sense it was no longer what it had been founded to be.
Right.
And at the time, in 2010, this read as, the screed of a homeless person outside the subway. Like, like NATO's coming to get you, and you're like, NATO's in Afghanistan? What are you talking about? And what I found so interesting about 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and or annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine, was that it had, in one moment, reanimated NATO and revived its raison d'etre, and then also called its bluff and kind of annihilated it. It also, what I thought was so dangerous about that moment was it completely negated the idea of nuclear nonproliferation, because the fact that the US and Britain did not come to Ukraine's aid, given the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine, which had inherited a huge Soviet nuclear arsenal, gave it up, with Russia, Britain, and the UK guaranteeing its territorial sovereignty as a result. So one of the parties violates the agreement, the other two are just like, And if I were a country anywhere else in the world, Iran, North Korea, I would say, well, that is, I will never give up my nukes. In fact, I'm going to rush to develop them, because that will be the only thing that guarantees my territorial sovereignty.
So one of the that's actually incredibly interesting and relates to a question I have for you. One of the questions that I wanted, part of the problem with talking about history, particularly for my readers, is that for many of my readers, the history of Europe ended in World War II, and in some senses, the history of Jewish Europe largely was seen as over, or that it should be over. And so it's hard in some senses for me to say, well, when did this all begin? But if I could ask you guys, if there is, and Julia, maybe that is your moment, or maybe you have another one, if there is a moment in recent memory when it felt to you like Europe had taken the turn that it was going to take into a new chapter characterized largely by whatever adjective you want to assign to it, whether it's weakness, whether it's irrelevance, whether it's diminished power, but a specific moment where it felt to you like, that's it, we're looking at the end of Europe.
For me, what really inspired me to write the book was the annexation of Crimea, because the rationale under which that occurred, that Vladimir Putin offered, was literally the same rationale that Adolf Hitler offered for his territorial annexations, the Sudetenland and in Poland, which is basically inventing claims of oppression against your ethnic comrades in a neighboring country's territory, and then deciding, well, I have to protect these people, I'm just going to annex and gobble up that territory. The same exact rationale, and this matters not only because of the letter of the law, you obviously don't want to be violated, but because there are large Russian-speaking minorities in other parts of Europe, and particularly the Baltic states.
Right.
And
in New York.
And in Brighton Beach. Brighton Beach could be next on the list. No, but seriously, I mean, you could feel, I travel to that part of the world quite frequently, to the Baltic states. There's a definite chill that was caused after this. And I have to tell you, when Donald Trump became president, the chill became even more extreme, because you might recall during the campaign, Donald Trump was asked, would you come to the defense of NATO allies if they were threatened by Russia? And the proper response from anyone seriously contemplating becoming president of the United States is absolutely. His response was this conditional, well, it depends on how much they've paid. The most offensive comment to me during the presidential campaign, for most people it was the Access Hollywood tape or what he said about Mexicans. For me, because I spent a lot of time in Estonia, it was when Newt Gingrich said, well, Estonia, it's a suburb of St. Petersburg. Why should we go to nuclear war over this tiny little country? And Estonia, I'll have you know, has fought with us in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the most pro-American countries you could imagine. And so to hear this kind of rhetoric from the Trump campaign was very worrying. And it was only, I think, 3 weeks ago that Donald Trump finally came out and said that we would honor Article 5, which is the collective security clause of NATO. So this is new territory. To have an American president offering this sort of ambiguity about our security commitments in Europe is a very dangerous situation at the end.
Brett, did you have one of those moments?
I lived in Brussels between 2000 and 2002, which were interesting years in Europe. I mean, I remember quite vividly on the Grand Place, there was a little ATM machine one night going and getting euros as opposed to francs from and there was a tremendous sense of Europe had arrived. This was a great moment. I was a little less optimistic about Europe I mean, I'm actually in sympathy with the idea of the euro, but the kind of the Europe's moment for a variety of reasons. One of which is this: I lived in a little apartment off the Grand Place, and on my jogging route was the neighborhood of Molenbeek, which at the time was just a kind of a gritty neighborhood where the population was overwhelmingly from North Africa. I ran there because the canal in Brussels goes through it, so you can get long stretches without having to cross streets. But I would look around and think, this can't be good. And sure enough, 15 years later, it was from Molenbeek that the massacre, the killers of Paris, then later the killers in Brussels, all of them emanated there. The real moment, though, came after the beginning of the Second Intifada. I had been reporting from Israel just on the eve of the Intifada, and it was so clear, if you were spending time in Gaza or Ramallah, that Arafat, in the wake of the failed Camp David negotiation, wanted to start something with the Israelis. And so something starts. Sharon takes his walk on the Temple Mount. That's a pretext. You have these horrendous scenes of these two Israeli reservists who drive into Ramallah and are brutally, not just murdered, but murdered as in a... Lynched. And I'd done all this reporting for them, and I came back to Brussels. And it's funny being Jewish with a name like Stevens, because you become a party to conversations that you might not otherwise...
Brett is not the most Jewish first name either, so I think...
My grandfather was cunningly disguised the old world heritage. But what I really saw was all of a sudden the feeling that Europeans now had a fantastic pretext to speak of Israel using tropes that struck me as unmistakably anti-Semitic. And just to round that out, shortly after the beginning of the Second Intifada, The Economist had a lead editorial in which, and I think I'm quoting this verbatim, it said, Israelis are a superior people, their talents are above the ordinary, but they must curb their greed for other people's land. And I thought, well, if you say Jews are a superior people, their talents are above the ordinary, but they must curb their greed for other people's money,
right.
You would have a classic anti-Semitic trope. And that's when it really struck me. It wasn't the return of anti-Semitism so much as it was the recrudescence, the reappearance, like a virus that has gone dormant and suddenly flowers in this unpleasant way.
Julia, do you have a moment? Is it the Crimea invasion?
It was a kind of constellation of moments. The Crimea invasion, also reporting a story that summer. It was the summer of 2015. It was in the middle of the refugee crisis, which, I mean, those images from Europe and the various responses to the refugee crisis were just like, this can't be good, this can't end well. And I just remembered the words of an Obama administration official at the time who was this kind of liberal interventionist, kind of adrift in this administration, kind of screaming into the hurricane. And I remembered that the summer before, he had, we were watching Syria really kind of collapse. Like, it had gone to a whole new level. And I remember it was, again, summer of 2014. Everybody was thinking about Ukraine. This was before ISIS made their debut with the beheading of James Foley. And he said, I was always saying we should get involved in Syria. I was always saying we should intervene and impose a no-fly zone or something. And I predicted that it would be bad. I had all these visions of how bad it would be, but I never, in my wildest imagination, thought we'd lose Europe because of it. And at the time, I was like, what are you talking about? And then, fast forward a year, and you're seeing these people walking on train tracks in Europe. You have, I mean, for me as a Jew from Eastern Europe who has, even as a child, conscious memories of Eastern European anti-Semitism, seeing the way that specifically Eastern European countries reacted to to people who needed help, the way, the language in which the refugees were talked about. I remember that being really dispiriting. And also, I have to say, I remember thinking at the time that this is bad for Europe because it gets under the facade of Europe that it shares Western values about citizenship being decoupled from nationality and ethnicity. Yeah, that was the summer I was reporting on ISIS from Europe as well. And, you know, people who were Norwegian but black, or Danish but black, and saying they didn't feel Danish or Norwegian because they weren't born there. Even though they were born there, and white Danes and Norwegians saying they didn't feel that they, you know, and I just remember thinking, like, I knew it, Europe. I knew it. Like, all this stuff about, you know, citizenship and egalitarianism, equality, brotherhood, et cetera, that this was all a facade, and that actually you remain tied to your ugly ethno-nationalistic past. And I thought, thank God I'm an American. This will never happen here.
Sorry, can I just tell one anecdote in this
sure.
connection? Has nothing to do with me, but years ago when I was in Israel, I heard Amos Oz tell a story. And of course, Oz is very much a man of the left in Israel, but he's a two-state solution Zionist. So he was relating an encounter he had with a very left-wing Norwegian journalist, left-wing anti-Israel Norwegian journalist, who was pressing Oz, why can't you have a one-state solution with Jews and Arabs on equal footing in a single binational state? And Oz sort of looked at him and he said, well, why don't you just have a binational state with the Swedes? And the Norwegian looked at him and said, Mr. Oz, clearly you know nothing about the Swedes.
Right. I had a conversation with a Holocaust survivor I guess it must have been a year and a half ago, when there was a particularly intense moment in Syria. And the survivor's granddaughter, who I know, had shown him Twitter and the response of journalists and politicians on Twitter to, maybe it was actually even the flattening of Aleppo. And the survivor, who I know, said, oh, God, thank God this wasn't around back then. I mean, we'd still go to Auschwitz, but I'd have to read this shit on the way. And I thought...
Jokes only a Holocaust survivor can tell.
Exactly. But I've thought about that a lot, in part because I do want to ask you guys about the role of mediating institutions and the way in which what we tell ourselves and how the media covers things. But even before I do that, I do want to talk about the way in which history gets written. Jamie has written a little bit about this for me, and a little bit about the way in which Europe and certain European countries' decision to rewrite their own past, particularly their World War II history, is, in Jamie's own words and own assessment, a conscious falsification. And I'd like for you all, in some senses, Julia, obviously, I know you have what to talk about falsification of history, I think in part because Russia's really good at it. But what I'd like you to talk about is the way in which that falsification of one's history plays into contemporary politics.
Yeah, so the chapter on Hungary is it focuses on a World War II memorial that was built in 2014. And Hungary, you have to keep in mind, was an ally of Nazi Germany in World War II. And the Hungarian government assisted in the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz. In this memorial, it's called the Memorial to the Victims of the German Occupation, which is sort of a strange way to describe, German troops on an allied country's territory, but that aside. And it depicts an angel representing the nation of Hungary being attacked by the German eagle. And so you basically have the entire nation of Hungary being this innocent angel being, eaten alive by Germany. And looking at this, you wouldn't know that it was the Jews who were the primary victims of the Holocaust. It wasn't the Hungarian nation. It was Jewish Hungarians. And it was Hungarians who were, in many cases, assisting in this. This is an official memorial. It's right in the heart of Budapest. And it's part of a broader history rewriting campaign that has been going on in Hungary for about 7 years now. And it really started very soon after the current government came to power in 2010, when you started seeing maps appearing in Hungary that showed Hungary's pre-World War I borders, where the country was 3 times the size what it is now. And you can only imagine the outcry in Germany if Germans started showing maps with the Ost as part of Germany. I think it's probably illegal in Germany to actually do that. And so now we're at a point where, having started this history rewriting campaign, Viktor Orban, the right-wing prime minister of Hungary, is now openly calling for illiberal democracy. He gave a speech calling for this and is trying to make the country into that. And so I really see a direct thread between this rewriting of the past in order to sort of write a very dark future.
Brett?
Well, look, another memory. I'm in a. I shouldn't even admit this. I was at Davos. This is a Tom Friedman moment.
Did you talk to a cab driver?
He's a colleague now, be careful.
No, I mean, it's just, look, so I was in Davos, and I'm listening to Joschka Fischer, this is about 12 years ago, talking about European history. And Fischer's capsule description of European history is that sometime in the late 1940s, wise men in Europe decided that war was a big mistake and decided that they would just choose a better way. And along came the European Economic Community, which became the European Community and the European Union, and depicted all of this as a kind of an act of high-mindedness that never had brute political facts as the genesis, and it all kind of took place in this kind of Kantian sphere of rationally choosing perpetual peace. And I was just struck by the extent to which a German foreign minister was prepared to rewrite history in order to favor a political project that was supposed to be based on soft power alone. That's to say, they wanted the idea that Europe was just all about, like, people, why can't we get along? Kind of, it was a land of Rodney Kings, and we were just going to get along, and that would be it. And you didn't need armies, you didn't need a sense of inside, outside. You needed none of the kind of, Hobbes could be written out, if you will, of, you're all political philosophers, so you know what I'm talking about, of the political narrative. That is to say, the power element that's required for liberal government to function, liberal in the broadest sense, was eliminated from Fischer's story. Now, the truth is that Europe came about because Germany, which had tried twice in the 20th century to conquer Europe and abuse its neighbors, was destroyed completely. Europe came about because American power intervened to build up a new way of a democratic Europe, and Europe persisted out of the immediate threat of a Soviet sphere that ran all the way from Vladivostok to Checkpoint Charlie, or the Fulda Gap. And so essentially Europeans like Fischer were telling themselves this fable, and it turned out to be an extremely damaging fable.
Can you walk us through because I actually think it's a recent enough example, and it's actually really interesting. Because can you walk us through how the lie that they told very recently about their own not so far in the past experiences create the mess that we're looking at today?
Well, I mean, a number of points come to mind. Number one, Europe disarmed itself.
Right.
And it turns out that that has consequences, especially when your partner across the Atlantic decides they don't necessarily want to be in the policing business, as we mentioned earlier.
We're going to get.
And so Europe has no capacity, literally has no capacity to deal with the crises on its periphery, whether it's in Ukraine, Syria, or potentially the Balkans. That's a real problem. By telling yourself that hard power doesn't matter, you create a situation which invites believers in hard power, like Vladimir Putin or Bashar Assad, from practicing this. I think the second thing is, and I have to say, in Brussels, there was a kind of a disdain for, I don't want to say populism, but a disdain for a feeling that democratic sovereignty should still count even in a cosmopolis of Europe.
Right.
And that helped contribute to Brexit, to this simmering resentment of the mandarins, or the fonctionnaires, to use the correct language, at the center, who always acted as if they knew better. And the final point I would say is it led to a kind of an intellectual mediocrity among European elites. When you meet a European civil servant, and they're extraordinary people. They will speak 5 languages, and their English will be better than your own. I say this married to the daughter of one of those fonctionnaires whose English is better than my own. I'm like, Corinna, English is your 4th language, So they're individually very impressive people, but there's a kind of a sameness to their thinking. That is to say there's a problem in Europe, whatever it is, pollution, the environment, high unemployment, terrorism. What's the solution? More Europe. We need more Europe. We always need to centralize and harmonize functions typically delegated to, push down the responsibility chain. And the fact that sort of thinking went unchallenged for so long and became this kind of dominant and somewhat stupid conventional wisdom is what allowed, to some extent, the Geert Wilderses and Marine Le Pen's and Nigel Farage's, all of whom I consider completely disgusting, disreputable people, nonetheless, to say, hey, something's wrong here. And they were picking on something. The complaint was right. It's just that their solutions ran towards the fascistic.
Julia, I want to ask you something, because and I'd like it in some senses, if it can be, to segue into a conversation about America right now and the role of America in its relationship, Brett alluded to it, in the way in which America telegraphs certain messages to Europe. But if you can actually stretch, if any of us could actually think back before November and stretch back into the previous administration, could you talk to us a little bit about, however you want to define the period, but the recent period of Vladimir Putin's thinking and the way in which he has not, may not see the vacuum left both by Europe and then eventually by America as a potential opportunity for himself, and may have actually seen it before we did.
You ask very expansive questions.
I'm giving you a lot of room.
So, I think that for Vladimir Putin, the things that we, until I would say Brexit, have seen as strengths, he, after a certain point, realized were weaknesses. I think at first he chafed against Western and especially American hegemony. He, it's interesting, this year is the 100th anniversary of the to 1917 revolutions, which the Kremlin is completely ignoring because they are very inconvenient to Putin. The one anniversary they are marking this year is the 10th anniversary of Vladimir Putin's Munich Security Conference speech, which is basically the only ideological document Russia has. And it's an important one because it's not a constructive vision. It's not, we're going to build this, we're going to develop this. It is just,
Right.
hey, remember that thing that happened in 1991 where we all decided that the kind of Soviet way was the wrong way and the Western liberal way was the right way, and that we're all going to do that? I would like to now register an objection. I don't agree. It is not a one-size-fits-all thing. We're going to do democracy our way, and furthermore, you can no longer call all the shots in the world. It is not good for the world. It's also not good for you, and you're always getting it wrong. This was, of course, at the height of the Iraq disaster in 2007. But what he suggested was just, we also want to be at the table, and we want to cause friction. We want to, when you, the US or NATO, try to make a decision, we're not going to suggest an alternative. We're just going to throw sand in the gears. And this is the kind of division. And then, at that point, NATO was obsolete. Kind of Europe was boring and stable. The US was on these various foreign adventures. Eventually, somewhere along the line, Putin realized that the West was basically a paper tiger, a house of cards, whatever, and that you didn't need all that much to make it all implode. And that if you just, he's kind of, and I think this is what's interesting about people like Trump, like Marine Le Pen, like Farage, like Wilders, is that, so they are terrorists in the mold of Vladimir Putin. They're terrorists in the sense of the way the 9/11 hijackers were terrorists. They used the openness of American society, the freedom to travel, to sign up for flight lessons, to get student visas and have academic exchanges against the country. They weaponized these very benign seeming things. And
Like Twitter.
like Twitter. Who thought? Who would have thought? And he has he has been very successful in doing what he said he would do, which is for centuries, the ideas, the forms of government, the ways of running a state, the ways of thinking came from west to east.
Right.
And around, I would say 2011, 2012, he started pushing back, and the wave started going the other direction. And eventually, of course, it reached our shores as it was going to.
I think it's, one of the things that I think can be confusing for people, and it might not.
And what's interesting about what he's done is that he has used American type of rhetoric. That America, for example, try substituting, when I say Russia, try substituting America in. Russia is more than a country with borders, it is an idea. Russia is a unique country with its long history and culture and a mission given to it by God. These are things that Americans think are natural for us, but weird for Russia to have. And so he is deploying rhetoric that we understand also against us.
I think that what may be confusing, and if we can, I do, on our way to getting to America, I'd like for us to just zoom out a little bit to a bird's eye view, because part of the thing that's confusing right now about global politics is the way in which lots of different actors who are ostensibly from different political sides, in fact, seem to be operating on the same principles.
Yeah.
So, Jamie, for example, you have said to me that you believe the acceptance of Corbyn in the UK mirrors for you the acceptance of Trump.
Yeah.
Even though technically the average person would say that Trump is from the right and Corbyn is from the left. So rather than focus necessarily on the details, what would be helpful would be how does a regular reader or regular person make sense of what's happening in all of these countries when it seems like all of these leaders actually come from different directions. But what essentially you're all saying is that they're all moving their countries in similar directions.
I think we have to look beyond the typical left-right political spectrum that we're used to, and we're seeing a new political spectrum that is emerging, you could say, between open and closed. I mean, if you look at France, in the first round of the presidential election, over 40% of the French people voted for either Marine Le Pen or a gentleman named Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's basically a neo-communist, whose great insight is to reduce the already onerous 35-hour work week in France to 32 hours. And whose foreign policy, however, is very similar to Marine Le Pen's. Pro-Russian, anti-NATO, anti-American, with some added affinities for Latin American populists. But if you actually look at their economic policies, they're very similar. Heavily statist economic policies. And in fact, Marine Le Pen can count upon a very large number of voters who used to vote communist. The Communist Party used to be very big in France. Then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of those people went to vote for Marine Le Pen. You mentioned earlier Jeremy Corbyn, who is the leader of the Labour Party. And I just got back from 2 weeks in the United Kingdom. I was there during the election. This is a man who really is sinister. And it's hard for a lot of people to see that because they look at him and he seems like this very avuncular, nice guy who he tends to his garden and he makes his own jam. And it's very English-eccentric, right? But it's also a man who literally, from the day he became a member of Parliament, has stood with every single enemy of the British state, from the fascist Argentinian junta to the Irish Republican Army to Hamas and Hezbollah. And as far as Jews are concerned, and this is something that I think would concern the audience here, this is a man who calls Hamas and Hezbollah his friends, whose elevation to power has coincided with such an upsurge in public anti-Semitism within the Labour Party that there were 2 investigations into it, one by Parliament, one by the party itself. This doesn't really happen. You know, political parties in democratic countries don't have to self-regulate because of racism within their ranks. He's now emboldened because of the electoral result last week. And you are seriously hearing Jewish people in England talk about their future, about whether or not they should leave. The acceptance of this by Britain, where 40% of people voted for the Labour Party. Now, obviously, you know, most of them were voting for other reasons. They were voting because they wanted to protest the hard Brexit that Theresa May was trying to push through, or they're just Labour voters, and that's tribal for them. I'm not by any means suggesting that the vast majority of people who voted Labour are anti-Semites. But just as people who voted for Donald Trump had to have had a pretty high tolerance for misogyny and xenophobia and nativism and all these other horrible things, if you voted for the Labour Party last week, you had to have a pretty high tolerance for anti-Semitism. And this is not something that, you know, Britain is an open country. The Jews have done very well there. British Jews never thought that they would be the ones having these conversations. It was the French Jews who were the actual victims of murderously violent anti-Semitism. They're the ones who are supposed to be, you know, leaving in droves to go to Israel. But now you are hearing these conversations around dinner tables in Finchley and Golders Green and the other Jewish neighborhoods.
Impressively, every single one of the audience questions is about Europe. So before I get to them, I actually, and they're all questions, by the way. I want to commend you for nobody writing these speeches.
There are no Jews in the audience.
Exactly. Every single one of these questions is great, so thank you very much. But before I get to these questions, I would like us to stay for a second on the U.S., because I think it would be negligent not to. Julia, if you could tell us a little bit about, obviously, Russia as an idea, as a gossip item, as a news event, has itself created this insane and kind of, certainly in our lifetime, hasn't had an unprecedented role in the images of American politics, let's say post-Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about how you see Trump and, I think it's important to note, Congress playing into the future role that America will or will not have in the global stage? Sounds like it's good news.
Again, I think I have to go back to Putin as terrorist. You know, there's a reason it's called, what he did in Crimea, what he did with our election is called asymmetric warfare, right? It's the array of power, or the imbalance of power, is quite obvious. And so he's doing a lot with a little. And we're helping him. There was hacking, there was interference, there were things they could have done that they didn't do. But we're kind of the hysteria into which we have fallen that allows us to not examine, for example, the fact that, you know, why is it that we don't agree with Russia? Why is it bad for the US president to align with Russia? And why is it bad that about 40% of our country decided that, for whatever reason, this guy named Donald Trump was okay and should have the nuclear codes? Like, we are focusing on this so much that we're not addressing the issues. I mean, there was a brief moment after the election when New York and DC and LA freaked out and said, what happened? You know, everybody started buying the hillbilly elegy, and, you know, let's all go on field trips to West Virginia to try to understand the anger and why they hate us so much, and what is this political, cultural force that created Trump, because he is a homegrown phenomenon. Russia did not, nothing drives, a colleague asked me at one point, he was like, I need your help on a story. So if you notice, Trump's first wife was Czech. His second wife, I mean, she was American, but he only had her for a couple of years. And then this third wife is Slovenian, Eastern European, and the two wives he had the longest are Eastern European. And they probably primed him to be pro-Russian. And I was like, you are out of your goddamn mind. Like, this is crazy. This is, when you talk to Russians about this, they're like, why are you obsessed with us? I mean, they're kind of glad we're obsessed with them because that's all they'd ever wanted for 26 years. But the fact that we're not addressing this domestically, the fact that we're not addressing currents of racism, neo-Confederate bullshit, fascism, leftist craziness, like the rise of the Antifa and the fascists constantly clashing in California.
Weimarization.
Yeah, like, but where we're focusing on I mean, this stuff is important, right? If Jared Kushner went to the Russians and said, hey, can I use your secret equipment? And even the Russians were like, yo, no, that's secret. Like, that's important, but we're letting it consume everything, and we're not, like, as if, like, these stories that Trump was groomed for decades by the Russians to be our president, we made Trump, and we have to answer to ourselves for that. That's not Putin.
But Brett, isn't in some senses this a way of us trying to get a hold of what's going on, of our place in the world? Is it an almost childlike interpretation of an incredibly complex and multi-year process that involves lots of other countries, involves lots of other continents, but instead it's just easier for us to be like, somebody maybe peed on Donald Trump in Russia, and so maybe that's the whole story. But instead, actually, it's much more complicated, and it involves like the EU and monetary policy, which is really hard. And so I guess what I'm asking you is how much of our focus on what we focus on in contemporary media is a way of avoiding the complex issues of the world right now, and how much of it is actually good work?
Well, I think that we are looking for our colleagues in the media, rightfully so, are looking for evidence of collusion, of influence, and forgive the cliche, kind of missing the forest for the trees. What's really fishy about Donald Trump? I mean, he was in Moscow, he maybe met with this, Louise Mensch has X, Y, and Z theories, whatever. That's not, I mean, I would be astounded that a campaign as shambolic as Donald Trump's was, that was simply the dog that caught the car, was actually conniving with Russian hackers or other, GRU or FSB agents to turn the election.
Who themselves weren't that great, I have to say.
Who are themselves insane, if you've ever met these guys. Crackpots. You meet them sometimes, they drive your cab, and you're like, oh my God, stop talking. But here's the real story, and this is what's important. That Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are partners, even if unwittingly, in a common enterprise to overthrow the liberal world order with the illiberal world order. You know, Jamie, I thought, very intelligently raised the subject of open versus closed. I think another way of putting it is liberal versus illiberal. And illiberalism is itself a robust political tradition with roots in Fichte and the German Romantics, with roots in the whole kind of counter-Enlightenment narrative that came up in opposition to the French Revolution, which emphasized rootedness, soil, authenticity, nature, place, culture, ethne, and so on, and which had offshoots in sometimes kind of an anodyne anti-Semitism, sometimes in a romantic environmentalism, and sometimes in a genocidal anti-Semitism, right? So because we've kind of lost sight of what political philosophy is, we're not even aware that there's this conversation. But if you had the misfortune of spending 4 years at the University of Chicago, you'd know about this. Some of you know what I'm talking about, which is that Trump, in his kind of barroom drunk way, and Putin in his weird sicko KGB way, and Viktor Orban in his own way, and Jeremy Corbyn and Marine Le Pen.
Oh my God, this is the worst bar ever.
It's like the bar at Star Wars, okay? Right? And so all of these people have kind of come up, and you can talk about the economic and cultural and even historical reasons why they've come up. But in the same way that Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and Stalin all came up as contemporaries and were able to seize power, this is what we're seeing right now. What's strange about the whole Trump thing was, why is this Republican? I mean, I've been a Republican until recently all my life. And the one thing you are as a Republican is you hate Russia. Right. I mean, it just goes without saying. I mean, not Turgenev, okay?
You want to hear
But what I mean is, they're the commies. You're against them, right? My whole family, on every corner, fled Russia. Like, lesson of my genes, get the hell out of Russia, right? So how is it that you get someone like Donald Trump who's suddenly sympathetic to Russia? What is it that in the way of a snake, he intuits about Putin, that they are on a similar mission? Even a snake doesn't know why it behaves like a snake. It just behaves that way. And that's what we're seeing now.
Julia, you sound like...
That's not fair to snakes, but no, I'm kidding. I think you're absolutely right, both of you, about the open-close dichotomy and the liberal-illiberal dichotomy, because it's no longer right-left, because none of these guys are really right-left anymore. They're utilitarian they take a utilitarian approach to these kind of 20th century concepts, and they take a little from the right and a little from the left. If you look at, for example, Trump or Putin, they both, are kind of very left economically, very right wing in terms of this ethno-nationalist insanity. But it's this kind of, it's an affinity on this kind of like this testosterone wavelength of, what's the point of rules? Rules are for weak people. We're all about strength. We're all about
willpower.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I remember back
Leni
in
Riefenstahl made a movie about it.
yeah, back in 2013.
It's on Netflix, right?
2013, 2014, when Putin was starting his sort of reactionary international with the anti-gay stuff, and I remember writing about Republicans and conservatives who liked Putin, and there was a very small group of people I was talking about. It was Pat Buchanan,
Dana Rohrabacher.
It was the paleo-conservatives, cranks. And then all of a sudden, fast forward not that long, 3 years, we now have the most pro-Russian presidential candidate since Henry Wallace, and he's a Republican. And we have a poll that just came out a couple weeks ago showing 56% of Republicans believe Russia is an ally of the United States. This cultivation of the American right, it is an incredible story.
Yeah.
And it has not been covered extensively enough. In 2015, the Russians brought a delegation from the National Rifle Association, including Sheriff Clark, that upstanding lawman. But you have to think how clever that is, right? I mean, the NRA is probably one of the most influential conservative organizations in the United States. Now, obviously, it's preposterous on its face that any American gun owner who believes in the right to bear arms to resist a tyrannical government would accept an invitation from Russia.
Where firearms are banned.
Obviously. I mean, Vladimir Putin is not going to allow his people the right to bear arms so they can stand up to a tyrannical regime. It's self-evidently preposterous, but not to a whole group of NRA leaders who went to Moscow.
And then you had also the World Congress of Families. Like there was also the religious nexus there between the Russian Orthodox Church, which is insane, and the kind of the Protestant evangelical right wing. But then when you go to Russia and you talk to the guys who are doing this, they're like, oh, we're in a like eschatological war with Protestantism. And I'm like, wait, why are you hanging out with them and passing? And they're like, oh, that's just, for right now.
Right.
This is all very
classic
convenient.
KGB,
Okay,
right? This
now-
is very good at doing this.
Guys,
and
here's what I
I'll-
want to do. I want to do a little bit of a lightning round because we only have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to get to a few more of these questions. So actually, I'm going to force you, just for this question, it's one-word answers.
One-word answer. Okay.
Which European country is in the greatest danger of economic collapse?
Italy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Wait, can I just, sorry, one
Yeah.
second, about Germany, to come back to your point about Germany and what Fisher said about, it's interesting that the European Union, the European community was in some ways devised to keep German power in check, and yet again, arising from the omni-shambles is Germany. And this time I have to say, like, if there's a third world war, it's like the Chicago Cubs. Maybe it's their turn. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad.
Actually, one of the
They kind of deserve it now.
one of the questions is if Brett could elaborate a little bit on your opinion of Merkel.
So there's an old joke. I'm going to get into trouble. This is televised.
No.
I think it is. No.
You know what the problem with German food is?
Oh God.
No matter how much you eat, at the end, you're still hungry for power.
Should we just leave it at that?
Look, I'll tell you what the problem with Merkel is. There are a few points. First of all, the reason Germany today has reserves of economic strength, ironically, isn't because of Merkel. It's because of the labor market reforms put into place by her predecessor, who's otherwise a tool of Russian power, Gerhard Schroeder. But Merkel has been a disappointment as an economic reformer. Secondly, I think Merkel behaved atrociously in insisting that Europe would A, take the lead when it came to Ukraine, and B, wouldn't lift a finger for Ukraine. And I was at Munich, at the Munich Security Conference, when she explained her rationale, which was Well, they'll just have to live under it, just as we did, meaning as an East German, and that was that. And I think that was a fatal signal that Europe had no interest in the freedom of the people who were at the periphery of Europe and who had depended on the strength and confidence.
And were striving for European ideals. They,
Right.
in some ways, took them more
The
seriously
first
than...
people to die under the EU flag.
And look, and the
Ukrainians.
third point is Merkel, look, obviously, once you had the refugee crisis, you needed a humane policy. But I think Merkel is the author of Brexit, because ultimately the blank check invitation to millions of refugees to come streaming in, sort of helter-skelter, on foot, was the moving force behind saying, put up the wall. And by the way, she might be the author of Donald Trump as well. This sudden sense that the barbarians are at the gate, that this is Rome all over again, and the Vandals and the Goths are just migrating towards the center. And I can tell you this is a view that was shared at very high levels of the Obama administration as well.
Right. That's actually that. So one of the questions is, what role Obama's, again, whatever noun you want to put in, weakness, ideas about American power.
Yeah.
What role did it play both in Crimea and in the refugee crisis? So in a funny way, maybe it's the bookend to your answer about Merkel.
Look, Obama, I wrote a whole book about this, but
Julia, I'd also like you to answer that.
Yeah.
question.
so just very briefly, I think Obama wanted to shrink America's footprint for a variety of reasons, geopolitical footprint. And as Julia put it earlier, you shrink the footprint, you allow the Putins of the world to wander in. I mean, it's incredible the extent to which everything that is happening today finds unmistakable echoes in the 1920s and 1930s. You know, when Neville Chamberlain said, you know, what could be more horrible than the thought that we might have to go to war over the Sudetenland, you know, conflict about which we know nothing, right?
Right.
That echoes with the sense of, well, what is Crimea to us? What is Estonia to us? And meanwhile, these guys like Putin and other dictators are vultures watching, circling from above, waiting to see how you behave.
Also, if you want to think why did Vladimir Putin do what he did in our election last summer, he spent 8 years taking the medal of Barack Obama. And he realized, you know what, I'm going to get away with this. And the most that happened was Barack Obama at some G20 meeting sticking his finger in his face and saying, Vladimir, cut it out. That was it.
Julia?
That was it.
So about what Brett said, I think, yes, there's, you know, Russia wants to expand just as America wants to shrink, and it goes together. There was a moment in summer of 2015 when, because of the previous year's invasion of Ukraine, double invasion of Ukraine, the Pentagon, for the first time since 1991, dusted off their plans for war with Russia and decided to update them. And talking to people who were working on this plan was kind of horrifying, because they were like, well, where would Vladimir Putin invade next? Naturally, it would probably be the Baltics. And he has more forces on the border than we do. They can overrun the thing before we can even radio the 82nd Airborne and start getting them on ships and planes. So what we'd have to do is probably let them occupy it and kind of, you know, push back a bit, because if you really read Article 5, you know, it's defense, but it's not victory. So as long as we're kind of doing something, we're fulfilling our obligations after Article 5. And it really echoed what Obama said in August of 2014 when he called in some reporters to sell his ISIS strategy. And at the end, he addressed Ukraine. And he said, look, ultimately, they just want this more than we do. And I think, and it's true. And this is just to return to what I was saying earlier, this is what Putin has realized, is that he can call our bluff. We have tried calling his bluff, and sometimes we've been successful, but he can even more effectively call our bluff. Because as Konstantin Malefeev, who's this very religious Christian oligarch who had bankrolled a lot of the separatists in Crimea and in the Donbass and is now under international sanctions, said, Russians remember war, but they're always ready for it and willing to do it, and they go to war ready to die, whereas Americans go to war with White Sox and comic books, is what he said. They know, the Russians know, that we're not willing to give up New York City for Tallinn or Berlin for Riga. And so therefore they're willing to, and in some ways they don't even have to invade these countries anymore. They have made their point.
Unfortunately, I think we've already gone over our time. There are a couple of more interesting questions, at least 2 of which are actually answered in Jamie's book. So again, I'm going to encourage you to buy it. I want to thank our panelists tonight, Brett, Julia, Jamie. Thank you so much for the conversation.